Step one for Alcoholics Anonymous, admit you have a problem. Step one for democracy is admit it's not a good system. It is a system that brings out people's intellectual worst. Why are you trying to go and revive something where people are already pretty maxed out on the amount of manufactured goods that they would want when we are so understocked in housing, which it is the second most basic human need. And we have built so little, and it's something almost everybody wants, and it's something that is a natural occupation for working class males, and it's just been strangled by regulation for 50 years. Well,
it's unbelievable.
Break the dam, unleash the river, man.
Everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The War of Ideas. Today we have a very special guest. I have the great honor of interviewing Dr. Bryan Caplan. He is an economist of the libertarian persuasion. He has written multiple books on some of our most controversial and, let's say, most public-facing political issues from his market-based economic perspective. I am very excited to get into it with him. So I'm not going to hold you up any longer, and we will invite him on. Bryan, it's great to have you.
Thank you very much for having me. Great to be here.
Okay, so before I ask you my millions of very specific questions, I want to ask you a more general one, which is could you give us a little bit of overview about the kind of structure of your economic beliefs and kind of how you came to believe them?
All right, good question. I went to UC Berkeley and got my economics degree there, so it's a very normal department. Got my PhD from Princeton. If you go back a bit, so I guess in 12th grade, I discovered Austrian economics, which seemed great to me at the time. I then, over time, learned, well, there's actually a lot of problems with that. And I would say I actually just learned a lot of mainstream economics. Probably the main thing that I picked up was a lot of interest in behavioral economics, which is also known as psychology and economics. This is really what is probably most important for my work is I just take very seriously how actual human beings think and feel, and think that if we're really going to understand anything about the economy, we've got to start with looking at actual human beings and seeing whether they fit the models or not.
Sure. So I've been very interested in Austrian economics for a long time as well. What issues did you see with it?
Well, you've got to actually know a lot of background, but let me put it this way. There are a lot of technical points in Austrian economics which just seem odd. Like, why do you care about this so much? For example, there's a standard thing among Austrian economists saying you can never be indifferent about two things. You always have a strict preference for things because you can't reveal indifference with your behavior. It's like, I don't know, maybe. And then they try to use this to say things like complaints about pollution aren't really valid complaints because you can't prove that someone doesn't like pollution because they're just sitting there coughing. This may seem like a parody, but it's not really. There is a lot of reverse engineering in Austrian economics of saying that textbook complaints about markets are just logically invalid and we're just not going to consider them, which, again, if you like the political implications, sound great, but if you got some common sense, it really does come down to, so you're saying that if an asteroid is coming straight for Earth, but nobody makes an effort to stop it, that proves that they don't care? Rather than say each person realizes that there's not much they can do about it, and so they're not doing much about it, not because they don't care, but because they think it's hopeless. So that's where I would really focus.
Right. That underlying assumption does seem a bit weird, that you have to be doing something in order to care.
Yes, but it is the kind of thing that Austrians push very hard, and at first you're like, all right, if you care that much, I guess I'll give it to you. It was like, oh, you're trying to use this to trump a bunch of totally reasonable complaints. Right. All right.
Well, I understand where it's coming. On the other hand, I do understand what it's coming from.
Yeah, of course, there's the issue of how do you know that a person who doesn't do anything actually cares versus just say, oh, I care so much.
Right. Like
one great thing about regular economics is they realize there are ways you can do this. For example, if someone says they really care about crime, then you could look and see, well, where do you live? Do you live in a high crime area? And how much extra money is it costing you to get out of that high crime area? And if you're paying a lot of money to avoid crime, that's pretty convincing evidence you actually care. On the other hand, if you don't, suggests you don't care very much.
Right. Yeah. Unbelievable insights there.
Actions speak louder than words.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wanted to actually go through your books and the topics of those books because
good.
I read a little bit about each one of them, and I've had some questions. So the first one I came across was the idea of rational irrationality. The kind of basically somewhat of an indictment of democracy in some ways. These books have been kind of getting more popular. I know Patrick Deneen had a book called Regime Change. It was kind of a post-liberal book that I found was interesting. So I'm curious, first of all, what is rational irrationality? What is that exactly? Why and how does that relate to voters?
All right, here's the best example. You're arguing with someone who says, look, Trump will definitely win in 2024. There's no doubt about it. It's absolutely certain. And you're looking at them and like, are you going for an Oscar? And you're like, no, this person really believes it. Then you say, okay, great. It's absolutely certain. How about you give me 10-1 odds for a bet? And then watch them run away.
Right.
Now, one story here is that they were lying the whole time and the offer to bet just exposed them. They thought it was plausible, but they didn't really think it was absolutely certain. They're just engaging in hyperbole for recreation. But again, it just seems that that's hard to believe a lot of times. People get so caught up in their own nonsense. So I say what's really going on when you offer to bet someone, it's not that they actually then reveal that they were lying, but rather they calm down under those incentives and rethink their position and realize, oh yeah, it's actually not absolutely certain. In fact, it's probably more like 1 in 4. I don't want to give someone 10-1 odds when 1 to 4 odds are the actual appropriate odds. So that's the best way revealing what I call rational rationality. Just ask someone to bet and you'll see that changing incentives changes the level of intellectual discipline that people apply to their ideas.
Sure.
So now this doesn't just apply to politics. You can see it applies to a wide range of things. So there's a lot of areas where people are passionate about. So people are passionate about philosophy or religion, politics, sports sometimes. And yet their irrationality is very high. Their passion is unrestrained when they're just talking. But when some practical consequences of error are placed on the table, people change the way they think. That's why I call it rational irrationality. People are being irrational. They're being unreasonable about the way they form their views. They're unreasonable about their confidence. But there's a method to the madness. They're not crazy all the way down, which is why I can't actually get people to bet their houses against my dime.
Right.
Rather, what's going on is that it's the kind of irrationality where on some deeper level, they realize that they are playing fast and loose with reality. And if you change the dial of the incentives, you then change the way that they think about the issue, which shows that they actually are capable of being much more reasonable than they were before. So really, it comes down to the idea that incentives actually change people's irrationality for the better, so that when people are just talking freely, their views tend to be at their worst. And when they are under the pressure of a bet, that's when their views are as good as they're going to get.
Right. This seems somewhat similar to the Austrian assumption that we were talking about earlier. Now, it's not exactly the same thing, but the idea that people's ideas and real beliefs are only revealed once they have like some real skin in the game. But when they're just saying that they care, that's less credible. It's interesting because the rational irrationality idea seems to agree that there's a kernel of truth to that, at least.
Yeah. I mean, this weird Austrian view, it starts with common sense, which is maybe people are lying, maybe they're exaggerating, maybe they're not being very thoughtful. The problem comes when the Austrian says, if you aren't revealing something in action, then it doesn't even exist.
Right.
That's the point where it just gets metaphysical, and there's an agenda, of course, of just saying, I'm refusing to consider a giant pile of evidence. But yeah, the common sense point of people are not always honest, that actions speak louder than words. That's a great point. It's one that good economists who have never heard of Austrian economics also are aware of. Although, yeah, there's also some bad economists who take things at face value, especially when it coincides with their political agenda. There's lots of political agendas. I don't mean to just beat up on Austrians. They're hardly the only ones who've got that issue.
No.
And yet, when they're my friends, I'm harder on them because I don't want my friends to be wrong.
Well, that makes you a good friend, I think.
Try.
What school of economics would you say you belong to?
So the one that I would feel most comfortable with is just behavioral economics. So also known as psychology and economics. It's the area of economics where they take psychology very seriously, where they care a lot about what human beings actually think and feel. I don't think of it as a political thing. I think of it rather as a common sense position. What you're going to go and study human behavior without wondering what human beings think and feel, that's stupid. So don't be stupid.
Yeah. Don't be stupid. That's a good motto.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the main area where I differ with other behavioral economics is I just care about a lot more psychology than they do. The problem with behavioral economists, in my view, is just that there's only a few areas of psychology they study, and I'm interested in the whole field. For example, I'm really interested in personality psychology. Do you have a personality, John?
I think so, but
yes, my view is everybody's got one, and there's a lot of great research on this. And even most economists who say they're into psychology don't care much about personality. I'm into intelligence research. I'm really into something that most behavioral economists never talk about, which is social desirability bias. It's the theme of it's really the organizing idea behind the book that I'm writing now, and it just says that when the truth is ugly, people lie.
Yeah, we will get there.
Cool.
So another question I had is about that irrationality. The book then tends to argue or indict democracy in this way, which is just how can it work when the vast majority of voters are because voting isn't like betting. Voting is
no, it is not. Voting is really talking. That's all it is.
Okay, and so what implications does this have for democracy for you? Do you think?
The big implication is that voters are off their rockers. Voters are out of their minds. Not just the ones who disagree with me either. Everybody, pretty much. Politics is like a religion. The incentives of democracy get people to think in a totally religious way. They're not interested in facts. They're not interested in argument. They're interested in consistency with a pile of dogma. So yeah, that's what democracy does. It brings people and hands them power, with incentives that bring out the very worst in them.
So what is the alternative? What would you? I mean, this is the $1 million question, right? So it's not fair to think that you're going to have a perfect answer here, but I am still going to ask, which is, if democracy is so bad, what's the alternative? What would you recommend to modify it? Or
sure, well, definitely not dictatorship, which is even worse. Right. There's interesting questions about the incentives of dictators. I do say the dictators tend to be more clear-minded. If you were to go and ask people, will people leave the workers' paradise? Like the answer that people want to believe dogmatically is no, of course not. Whereas when you're an actual communist dictator, you realize, oh yes, people will definitely want to leave this workers' paradise. We must shoot them. Right? Yeah. So dictatorship brings out terrible things in people too, in a different way. But in terms of what we can do to make things better, step one is really like with an alcoholic, just admit you have a problem. Step one for Alcoholics Anonymous, admit you have a problem. Step one for democracy is admit it's not a good system. It is a system that brings out people's intellectual worst.
Well, good luck with that first step.
Yes, but it's just a basic point. This is not a situation where people get together and have an intelligent conversation. It's one where we have a giant dogmatic pseudo conversation where we yell at each other and repeat a bunch of dogma. Both sides, all sides, are generally terrible in democracy. Never forget that. Now, in terms of what can be done once we accept that, well, for one thing, there are a lot of limitations on democracy. You can either say they're not democratic, or you can redefine democracy so that the First Amendment's democratic. I don't really care what labels you use, but the idea that limitations on majority rule improve things, I am totally down with that. Right. And just more generally, trying to take as many things as we can outside of the realm where we vote on it. That's what the First Amendment does. It says we're not going to have an election over what religions are legal. They're all legal. That's
Yeah.
it. Right.
Yeah.
We're not going to have an election. We're not going to vote about what things you're allowed to say. Right. And I would say that we're not going to have an election over whether or not you can go and regulate these industries. We're not going to have an election over whether there can be a progressive income tax. These are all useful ideas to consider at minimum. Some more restrictions in democracy, depoliticizing things to a high extent, because politicized things are run poorly.
Right, right. So there's another question here that is on the tip of my tongue, and I'm starting to lose, unfortunately. Yes. So that first step, I think, is really the problem area. I mean, I think that one of the great strengths of our system is that democracy is very much on a chain, right? Like, as you say, we have things in our constitution that we can't vote on, at least not easily, and people don't really vote directly; they vote for their representatives, and that's all good. Designing to expand the list of constitutional amendments that we don't list. Not regulating industry is a weird one, actually. Let's go there. You want to have it in the Constitution that the government can never regulate particular industries?
Right. So, like at the end of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, they put in a new amendment which says Congress will pass no law abridging the freedom of production and trade. I mean, I would say that it probably makes a lot more sense to be more specific, because that's sufficiently broad that it's just going to confuse people. But for example, I think it would be great to have an amendment saying that Congress shall have no right to prevent the immigration of people for residence and work. So Congress shall have no ability to say whether or not any human being on earth can go and accept a job. I think that would be a great start. There's actually, so I'm doing a new book on housing regulation. There, it actually did get to the Supreme Court in the 1920s as to whether zoning was an illegal taking. It was a 6-3 vote, but there were 3 Supreme Court justices that said, you cannot have zoning. It's illegal. You're taking people's property from them. So no.
Right.
So I think that vote was a bad vote, and they should have said that zoning's illegal.
I'm a big like constitutional law guy. I got to find that case and read it now. That's you piqued my interest 100%. But I think the real trouble here is the first step, right? Because unfortunately, a big part of the dogma, I mean, especially on the left side of the aisle, but I mean, this is true on both sides of the aisle, though increasingly less so on the right, as populists and post-liberals start to show up, which is democracy is our strength. Like, democracy itself, like as an abstract concept, as being an unmitigated good, is like a major part of the platform. And more than that, it's one of the major clubs that the left likes to hit the right with for being insufficiently committed to democracy. And they bring up J6 and stuff like that. So it's hard for me to imagine how in this political universe step one ever happens. Do you have an idea of how that would happen, or is that just kind of how it is?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I would say that populists, I think of them as being more vocally pro-democracy than the left, actually. So just worth pointing out, and actually probably more actually in favor of democracy. They're less likely to just say democracy equals whatever I want, and more likely to say that it's just whatever the will of the people happens to be. I mean, in terms of getting people to change their minds on this, I'd say that actually it's not that hard to get big concessions out of people, at least off the record. A lot of the problem is people don't want to say it publicly. Like I talk to a lot of left-wing professors, and if they are saying, well, democracy is great, I said, well, doesn't it lead the people that you think are terrible to be in power about half the time? Like, yeah. Well, that doesn't sound that great. Like, no, I guess it's not. It's not that hard to get these concessions out of people. I mean, especially when you say like voters are irrational. Well, you're like, no, they aren't. Well, how about the other side? Well, yeah, of course, them. Right. And then from there, it's like, well, how about a bunch of people on your side who seem like their knowledge of the subject is fairly thin? It's like, all right, I guess they're not all that rational either. So really it comes down to just you and a few of your buddies are rational and nobody else is, right? So in terms of getting that concession, I don't think it's so much hard to get it out of people, regardless of their political views, really, as it's just hard to get them to publicly stand by the admission.
Yeah, it's just it's interesting how deeply entrenched like that cultural hands off is for democracy.
Right. I mean, in a way, I would say the book that I'm writing right now, in a way, it is a big attempt to just get people to admit a lot of ugly truths. And how would you do that? I think the best way is actually by frontal assault and just say, look, you've got to admit there's a lot of ugly truths, right? Come
Like,
on, there's ugly truths, obviously. And when you put it that way, it's hard to deny it. It's just a general point of there's ugly truths. And once you get them to say that, it's like, all right, well, let's talk about some of them.
So what's the name of the book?
Oh, sorry?
What's the name of the book?
The book is called Unbeatable, The Brutally Honest Case for Free Markets. So it's about half done right now. I'm very pleased with how it's going. I think it might ultimately be my best book. Of course, we will see.
So what are some of the brutal truths? You mentioned zoning. I know I'm from Northern California, so kind of zoning regulations is a big part of the reason why house prices are so astronomically high, along with rent control, but mostly zoning, as far as I'm aware. But what other examples do you have? What other brutal truths?
This is one where I'd like to start with the really obvious ones, like nothing is perfectly safe. Yep. Nothing is perfectly safe.
No solutions, only trade-offs.
Yes, right. This is one where, like during COVID, all the people saying we have to do this because otherwise we won't be safe. It's like nothing's perfectly safe. We're always doing things that risk killing people. Like, people say the pandemic's over. It's a continuous variable. There's still people dying of COVID. We could be doing more in order to protect them, but it's more important for people to enjoy life and have convenience than to save those lives. That's an ugly truth. It's one that is built into any kind of sensible thinking about risk. And it's the policy power of the denial of this truth is immense. It's why we don't have driverless cars yet.
Right.
Because to prove that driverless cars will never kill anyone. I can't prove that. They're going to kill people. They're going to kill fewer people than what we got right now. And they're super convenient. And it's a great product. The end. Therefore, let's go. That's it.
Well, I think the debate there is a little bit more complicated. I will say though on the COVID thing is that it definitely, for those who think that we did the safe thing, people should start looking at the results of children in schools, like the reading literacy test results cratered.
Like no one dies from illiteracy, right?
No, yeah, nobody dies from lack of education. That doesn't seriously impact anybody's life, not at all.
Well, they're not dead.
Yeah, well, they're not dead, but you know, it still definitely has a negative impact. As far as the driverless cars thing, though, I think that there's a couple more problems with that I've had because I used to be really on the driverless cars train, but now I'm not so sure. And the reason for that is twofold, which is one, they will kill less people, but it's going to be a lot harder to find accountability for whenever they do mess up because if the manufacturers or the people who write the algorithm aren't going to want to be on the hook every time it messes up. Like you basically have a philosophical trolley problem that you have to code for. So you
it's not that bad. They just buy some insurance. Problem solved.
Think so?
Yeah.
Think that's it?
Like this is the kind of problem where obviously they would sell them. They know that they're in danger of getting sued and they're willing to take it because they've got a team of lawyers and they got insurance and they're going to go for it. Yeah, I mean, basically this is a problem where you might like if I said I'm going to go and start my own driverless car company, you as a friend might say, well, Bryan, you might want to consider the liability. And I'm like, oh yeah, but somebody's going to do it. They'll make a pile of money. They'll get screwed because the legal system is messed up and unfair, but it's not going to stop us from getting driverless cars. What's really stopping is the regulation and just the terror of the system.
Right. And then the second thing that is concerning is this is a point that gets brought up a lot by people on my side of the aisle, which is the trucking industry, for example, and what it would do to the trucking industry. Now, I'm very familiar with the idea of creative destruction. I understand that there'll be replacement jobs. I understand that on the net, like across the entire country, this will help more people than it hurts. However, it is going to hurt a certain amount of people very badly, and that amount of people is not small. And they also probably won't be able to jump on the train of whatever is created in the wake. What do you do with those people? What do you do with those millions who can't just learn to code during the transition period?
Well, I mean, ideally, people listen to my housing book and they'll get jobs in construction. So that is my big plan for helping the working class in general, not protectionism, but deregulating housing. So that's like if people would listen to me on that. My honest answer is, look, the internet has already destroyed way more jobs than all of trucking. You just go down the list of all the things, right? And it's like we're going to pass up this incredible opportunity. If you want to be really strict about this, you could just say, fine, we'll go and we'll give every trucker, $50,000 for every year as a trucker, and that'll be their retirement or whatever, and then we'll move on.
Yeah,
I mean, but to go and say we're going to hold this back because we have to save jobs in trucking, again, this is really the same as keeping like the whole horse industry afloat. That's a huge industry that got destroyed last time around. Right?
Yeah. I heard an idea from somebody that said that you allow the self-driving technology, but you basically artificially stagger it. So you just make sure it doesn't all happen at once, and you like slow down its entrance in the market, which creates a softer landing idea.
Yeah, you can do that. I mean, again, like the main issue with technology is normally that that it comes too slowly because of coordination issues. Like this is at least, like there's a lot of problems with electric cars, but one problem is you don't want to build the stations until there's tons of cars, and you don't want the car until there's tons of stations. Chicken the egg. And one of the best ways of doing it is just go gangbusters. Let's just go and put as many on the road as we can and just overwhelm it with with numbers.
Yeah.
Right? And yet regulation normally tries to slow things down. Like when, if anything, the sensible thing would be to try to speed it up. So yeah, anything where you're just trying to slow down the adoption of a new technology, I think is terrible. I mean, again, like the least bad thing that government could do other than nothing is just to go and say you get some money based upon how many years you were a trucker.
I would be, and that's something I would be somewhat open to, I think. And as far as the deregulation of the housing helping with this, is the idea that if you deregulate housing, there's just going to be a ton of new jobs suddenly appearing. Is that the idea? How exactly does housing deregulation solve the problem of out of work truckers?
Yeah, great question. Well, it does require that truckers be capable of doing construction work. Not all would be, but they are not so different in a lot of ways. So like, especially if you've got some kind of mechanical skill, easily goes into doing all kinds of construction. A lot of people have both already. So basically, if you deregulate housing, right now, we build a lot less housing than we are physically and economically capable of building because it's so hard to get those pieces of paper which allow the construction to happen.
The red tape.
Yeah. If you deregulate, then there will be a lot more building. And when you build a lot more, you will hire a lot more construction workers, which is a very natural place for people that are currently truckers to go. Of course, and very important to remember in general, something doesn't have to be a solution for everyone to be a solution for a lot of people.
Yeah. 100%. That's, what's interesting is that people talk about this, about why we should have self-driving trucks, and they kind of talk vaguely about creative destruction. And I always think, I'm like, well, that doesn't really help the truckers who are out of work in the short term. So it's nice to hear somebody give like an actual policy plan.
Right. I mean, this is my answer just for national conservatives too. There's a lot of people who are very concerned about, especially working class males, say they just don't really fit well with service sector jobs. We got to go and put up big trade barriers to revive our manufacturing industry or manufacturing. And my response to that is, why are you trying to go and revive something where people are already pretty maxed out on the amount of manufactured goods that they would want when we are so understocked in housing, which it is the second most basic human need. And we have built so little, and it's something almost everybody wants. And it's something that is a natural occupation for working class males. And it's just been strangled by regulation for 50 years.
It's unbelievable.
Break the dam, unleash the river, man.
It's unbelievable how long it's been true too. For 50, it just feels so demented. The other thing though that I hear, especially from my friends on the left, is that another part of the reason for high housing prices is due to BlackRock and similarly large companies buying up a ton of property and then owning it all and then selling it at higher markup prices because they just own so much of a market share. Is that a concern for you?
That's basically just a crazy conspiracy theory. I wouldn't put any.
What makes you say that? Because to my mind, the idea of a very rich entity buying up enough of the supply that they can raise the price seems like pretty, ABC logic. So
what is the actual percentage of any major city that's owned by any one company? Again, this is one of the most deconcentrated industries in the country, in the world. And again, the main thing that developers want to do You'll say, so it sounds like those are not developers. But anyway, the main kind of lobbying that's going on in this industry is people begging for permission to build more stuff. The main thing going on is not trying to go and restrict supply. The main thing going on is trying to get permission to have supply.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is.
I can lower the prices for you. Just let me build more.
Yeah. Like,
and then
of course, individual builders are probably not sitting around thinking, "Oh, my goal here is to go and make housing cheap." Their goal is to make money. But if there's anything we learned from Adam Smith, it's that the individual desire to make money leads to higher supply, which leads to, at the social level, to lower prices.
Right, and that's definitely a good thing. And then you could also make the argument that the higher supply, even if you believed in the BlackRock thing, if you actually increase that much of a supply, that would also kind of solve the problem by diluting the size of the market share anyway. So yeah, definitely interesting. Definitely agree on the deregulation. Again, I come from California, which is just like the capital of
me too.
Housing regulation. And it's just the most unbelievable thing you've ever seen. So, demented policies. Do you know why they haven't deregulated it yet? Do you know what the incentives are there on the governmental level for why?
Well, I mean, remember a myth of the rational voter, government's responding to voters. I mean, almost everyone understands that people who own homes are unsympathetic to new construction. What most people don't realize is that most people who rent are unsympathetic to new construction too. Why? Severe economic illiteracy. Most people do not agree that higher supply leads to lower prices. They just have some crazy conspiracy theory where it's a plot by rich fat cats to go and take your money from you. And the idea that, look, they're building things leads to more production, which leads to lower prices, is just rejected by much of the population. I'd say actually only a minority of the population accepts this basic truth. Right? Furthermore, a lot of it is just every complaint about housing that people have, they're not wrong. They're just petty and not important. Like someone says, "Oh, well, skyscraper will block my light." Like, yep, so it will. Tough luck. Build. Right? Or like, "Oh no, this could go and disrupt some migratory birds." Yeah, I suppose it will. Tough luck. Let's build. Right? And as long as people are willing to go and destroy billions of dollars of value for $100 complaints, then we're going to have these problems.
Right. I think that what people who say that they're having their views destroyed would argue is that I didn't just buy the house, I bought it for the view, and therefore in some ways you're violating my property.
Yeah. So you've got a property right to have the entire world revolve around you. Yeah, that's not how property rights work. Property rights, you have a specific property right in this exact piece of property, and everything else belongs to other people. And if they do what you want, you're great. And if they don't, tough luck. That is the traditional system, of course. In the 90s, so like I said, there was a famous Supreme Court case in the 1920s that was the big violation of 1,000 years of Anglo-American property law, which did change what you were able to do. So it's true that, for about 800 years, there have been rules about how someone does physical damage to your property. If they do smoke, if they have a pig farm with horrible odors, you can sue them for that. Basically, it was a very short list of complaints that got any attention at all. And even to get those dealt with, you had to go and fight it out in court, big pain in the neck, which is a feature, not a bug, as we now see. Because human beings are just such giant complainers. If you listen to them too much, then they will just crush progress. You've got to go and have your first, second, and third response to a complaint be, yeah, too bad, tough luck. And only if someone really persists should you listen to them.
Right. Rationality. Yep. Also, it should be noted that most of the zoning regulations that are strangling people aren't just like, oh, I want to protect my view. Correct.
There's so many different ones.
Unlimited.
In terms of the main, so like in cities, the big deal is regulating tall buildings. And a lot of that is about blocking views and that kind of thing, and blocking my light. But other really important ones. Once you get out of cities, there's a lot of regulations saying that you are not allowed to have multifamily housing, so you can only have single-family homes, which is a big deal because a lot of times apartments or townhomes are the much more profitable thing to make, and that's not allowed. Another really big deal is saying that every single-family home has to have at least an acre of land.
That's unbelievable.
I've got an acre of land. There's enough land to go and put 10 homes. Well, you can't do 10 homes. You can only do one. right? So
Yeah,
that's a big deal.
you're not allowed to meet the demand. We
Yes.
want people to be demanding. Like it's just like trying to project what you want to something that's just not compatible with the reality of the
Mhm.
situation. It's
Right.
reality.
There's the reality of some people don't want to have dense housing near them. But it's like, yeah, well, if we listen to you, we're going to choke off progress and we're done listening to
And
you.
also, more people disagree. More people would rather, like, you've been outvoted economically speaking as well.
Right. Unfortunately, the opposite is true politically speaking. And guess
Yeah,
what? It's politics where the votes count.
yeah. Well,
That's the unfortunate feature of democracy, which I talk about in my new book, Unbeatable. Markets
yeah,
do the good stuff that sounds bad. The government does the
yeah.
bad stuff that sounds good.
I'm stealing that quote forever now. I'm keeping that forever. Just so you know that.
Good.
Okay, so I want to move on to a couple of
Take
the
it
other
away.
topics in your books. Just a bit of a speed round because we're running out of time here. Um, you made an economic case for people having kids. Do I have that
Mhm.
right? Selfish case for kids.
Yes.
Now, I
Selfish
love.
reasons to have more kids.
Yeah, I think families are great and moral and necessary, and we're below replacement rates. But as far as I'm aware, conventional wisdom is that part of the reasons why childbirth has dropped, besides just cultural reasons of us not taking it seriously anymore, is because we don't need farmhands anymore.
Mhm.
So you're gonna have to explain to me what the economic case here
Mhm.
is for the modern Western world for people to have more kids because I don't see it. So I'm curious.
Yep. Yeah, great question. Yep. So just to be clear, the farmhands argument never made any sense either.
Oh, did it not? Okay.
Right? Because you suppose you got a farm. It's like, well, we need workers on our farm. We could either hire adults who already know how to do the job, or we could go and have a baby who will be completely incompetent for many years, prevent his mom from doing farm work for years, and then we'll go and put in all the effort to go and train him, and then eventually he'll be an adult, and maybe he'll go and help us for less than market wage, unless he decides that he doesn't feel like working in the farm and leaves. So, general view here, like even among economic historians, is that having kids has never been a good business venture.
Right.
Right. And I'm totally down with that. That's just common sense. But
Yep.
then it's like, well, then why did anybody ever have kids? For consumption. For consumption. Kids are consumer good and always have been a consumer good. It's like saying, what's the economic case for owning a television? It's like, yeah, because I like watching TV. What's the economic case for having kids? Yeah, because I like having kids. And you say, well, that's weird. It's like, it's not weird at all. What would Charles Darwin say? Like, why would people want to have kids? Well, if a million years ago, there were cavemen who said, oh, kids, boring. No, want kids.
And then
Well,
they're
then they didn't have any kids. And guess what? We're not descended from those cavemen. We're descended from
yep.
the cavemen that did like kids, just like every other mammal that you know of. Right. So I would just start by saying, like, there's never been a profit like a profitable investment to go and have kids,
Yeah.
except in rare cases. You need to think about kids as a consumer product, and there my big economic case is that people. One of the main reasons why people are having so few kids now is that they believe that this fashionable helicopter parenting style is necessary as an investment in your kid's future. There's just a very widespread view that if you don't go and give up your whole life for your kids, that they're not going to have much of a future. And there, what I talk about in my book is a pile of research on kids that are adopted and twins, showing that the effect of parenting on kids' adult outcomes is actually very small,
Mm.
which means that it is just false to think that you need to go and ruin your life in order to give your kids a decent future. And once you accept that truth, the obvious thing to do is stop doing stuff that you really don't like for your kids because you're not giving them this long run benefit. And then step two is to rethink the number of kids that you want. It's basically imagine that you've got a computer and you think that computers have a crash rate of 50%. So 50% of the time you turn them on, they'll do what they just did to us, where it would go like, zzz. All right, well, if you think that's true, you're probably not going to be very interested in having a computer. On the other hand, if you realize, oh, that's actually something that only happens one time in 1,000, it's like, oh, well, in that case, maybe I'll want one. So that's the heart of the book, is just getting people to rethink the how it actually is that parents affect their kids' outcomes. And then once you do that, obviously affect the way they raise your kids, but also then affect how many kids you want to have.
I have to say to you, this is perhaps I'm just a little bit dense, but it's somewhat difficult for me to see why this is an economic case at this point.
Well, because it's about price. So, like, imagine if I give you a coupon 20 chocolate 25% off. right? You could either say, I don't like chocolate, fine, throw the coupon away. Or you can say, I like kids, great. All right, well, now they're 25% cheaper than you thought, so rethink the number you're going to have.
I suppose it's the fault of my initial assumptions about what the argument was going to be like.
Yes,
Because
yes.
I was kind of assuming that you were going to tell me why kids aren't economic benefit.
No.
What it seems like you're telling me is that kids are not the economic costs that everybody pretends
Yes.
like they are.
Yeah, I mean, like I just take it for granted. Like,
okay, that's
again, the idea that like kids are a reasonable investment in terms of like just getting retirement money or something. Yeah, that's ridiculous. The only error is people thinking this was ever not true. Right? It's not true that in an agricultural society that having kids is a good plan. It's a dumb plan. Why not hire actual competent workers who can do their job right now instead of going and having a baby who's going to be useless for many years? Right? You know, that was never a good idea.
Babies are good. That's why. Yeah.
Like, the reason to have kids is as a consumption good. It's true today. It's true in the past. But the problem that people have with having kids right now, in my view, is just that they have made it into a horrible chore. And I say the problem is not the kids. The problem is the parents and the false theories they have about child development.
100% agree. I think that's definitely part of it. And also, I don't feel like people take it as seriously as like a good and moral like duty. Right? As I think that's also happened as well.
Yeah, you know. So of course, there's a lot of green philosophy saying that it's evil to go and even have kids.
Yeah,
I do have a chapter talking about how human beings do some bad things to the world. They also do some great things. The great things are more important than the bad things.
Yep.
So that's my big story.
Hey, yeah, it's a pretty solid argument, I have to say. So that's really interesting. When I was reading that about you, I was really confused. I was like, they're not, there's no way these are economic that positive. Yeah. I will say though about the retirement thing, the odds that like your kids are going to give you enough retirement money is low, but the odds that your kids will be there to like take care of you.
Yes.
That's not exactly an economic benefit, but that is, I mean, I guess we've kind of replaced that familial system with like, the government taking care of you when you're old, but that seems.
Yeah. I mean, but again, the truth is that it was like, as far as we can tell, it's basically never been true that young people on average helped old people.
Never.
So remember, before Social Security, old people died at a much younger age, but as long as they were alive, the large majority of them were more than pulling their weight, taking care of grandkids. Remember, retirement used to not really be a thing. So if you make it to 65, you don't retire, you just keep working.
Yeah.
Like there really never was this time when kids were on average supporting their parents. The only real exceptions are cases where like in East Asia, where there's some countries where the elderly were super poor and their kids were just way richer. Then it looks like kids actually did start making net transfers to their parents, but that's really rare. But you are right on the elder care. So yeah, one of the strongest predictors of ending up in assisted living is not having enough kids. Having no kids, you're real likely to end up in assisted living, and the more kids you have, the less likely. I mean, even if during COVID you realize, wow, assisted living sucks. Yeah, well, there is that.
Yeah, 100%. That was a particularly monstrous part of COVID-19 is the elderly trapped in nursing homes and they're not allowed to see their family for years.
Yep.
Like that's. Yeah. Hey, this is the safe
option. Goes back to
the safe option.
Safety is the most important thing in the universe. Quality of life is the most important thing.
Right. Yeah,
safety is one component of quality of life.
Yeah, this is the safe option. We're going to retard an entire couple grades of kids learning, and we're also going to trap like millions of elderly away from their families in a nursing home.
Yep.
But
yeah, I mean, I did write an essay saying, like, right now, of being of sound mind and body, if there's ever another pandemic when I'm old, I don't want to be isolated. I want to take my chances. If I die, I die. I don't want to be alone.
Yeah, yeah. Oof. Okay, speed round a couple more. So case against education. That's so interesting. And you know why it's interesting is because Vivek Ramaswamy has been talking about how he's going to obliterate the federal Department of Education. I know that it's pretty recent. Jimmy Carter created it way back in the day. And I personally have beef with the Department of Education because they're the ones who made me learn Common Core. And I was not happy about that. So in, purely economic terms, when people hear this, when people hear people like Vivek say, we're getting rid of the Department of Education, they're like, oh my heavens, they want to take us back to the dark ages. And I understand the constitutional case against the Department of Education on a federal level. I think it violates localism pretty clearly. But on like a practical level, why do you take this position?
Here's the main thing to do. Just think about all the things you had to study in school and then ask yourself, what fraction of them do I remember and use them in real life?
Yeah.
That's hardly anything.
That's not a high
The curriculum is otherworldly. Most of it is not important in real life. And yet we have this strange system where you've got to go and excel in studying subjects that are irrelevant in the real world in order to actually get a good job. Right? That's weird. What I do in the book is explain, first of all, why this thing is true. And the answer is that we have a system where the way that you convince employers that you're worthy of an interview is to jump through a bunch of hoops, which, while they don't actually prepare you for the job, it is a good way of convincing employers that you have the skills that you need. There's a technical name for this in economics. It's called signaling. Basically just saying that what you're really doing in school primarily is getting stamps in your forehead, grade A worker, grade B worker. Right now, if you say, all right, so maybe this is the purpose of education, fine. The main thing, though, is that if what you're learning in school is actually useful skills, then you can enrich the whole society by having people do more. But if what's the main thing happening in school is getting stamps in your forehead, you can't enrich the society by putting more stamps in everyone's forehead.
Yep.
Instead, what happens is that you get what's called credential inflation, where you need more degrees, more years in school to get the same jobs that your parents and grandparents were able to get with less.
Sounds so
So I say this is the fundamental problem with education, is that they're teaching a bunch of useless stuff, and they've put us into this dysfunctional world where the only way to get a good job, or the main way to get a good job, is to do well in a bunch of stuff that isn't relevant. And you just got to spend a lot of your years in life wasted in school. So, and then my answer for this is, don't just get rid of the Department of Education. We need severe educational austerity, make it a lot more expensive, make it a lot less accessible so that people get less and then start their lives earlier. And if I'm right about the uselessness of the curriculum, this will be totally fine. People will just be able to get jobs at an earlier age with less education, because employers will no longer say, oh, you didn't go to college. Well, then you can't possibly be a good bartender.
It seems, I will say that while I'm not sure I'm going to disagree with your fundamentals, it seems like an awfully large gamble. That's
yeah. I mean, I'd say, look, to me, I would just say, like, I am more sure about this book than almost anything else that I've done.
Well, I'm excited to read it.
Just because, like, I've been in education for so many decades, been in school nonstop since I was 5, and the idea that what we're doing is useful in the real world, I think, is just absolutely lunacy. Like, it is not. Like, it's just a tiny fraction of stuff that you learn in school is useful in the real world. The rest of it is just a waste of time from a social point of view.
Yeah.
Right. And then like in the book I go over, there's a lot of other kinds of evidence. If just your own firsthand observation doesn't convince you, there's many other bizarre facts that can really only be explained by this model. Like, for example, most of the financial payoff from college comes from graduation. If you're one class short of graduation, you barely get any economic benefit
at all. Yeah.
If they're teaching you useful skills, that wouldn't make any sense. But if you're trying to get a stamp on your forehead, completed the socially mandatory curriculum, thereby showing that you are the kind of conformist person we want at our firm, makes sense then.
Well, and even if you were taught useful skills, if without the stamp, then it's just the employers aren't going to pick up on that or give that much weight, it seems.
Well, but the puzzle is, what if they saw that you're one class short of graduation? Why do they regard that so differently?
Because they think that you're not somebody who's willing to, see things through to the end.
So then it's the signal. It's like, so he failed to do what's expected in our society. But again, if we went back to a world where only 5% of people had college degrees, then employers cannot afford to be so picky.
And I mean, those signals aren't like worthless, but they're just not really they've been over prioritized, I think.
Yeah. What I say is, like, socially, we could have had a very different system where the way that you show your reliability is by getting a job and being a good worker, which is the old system. It's not like in 1950, we didn't have a way of figuring out who were reliable workers. It's just the way that we did it was by saying, get a job, and then we'll see whether you can move up in this company. Now we have put so much emphasis upon education as the way, right?
Sure. Last thing before we have to go is I have to ask you about this is two things. One, you claim that you're a market economist, pretty obviously, but you kind of were rallying against Austrian economics. What's the difference precisely?
It's hard to explain without a big lecture. Basically, Austrian economists have this list of specific weird doctrines that distinguish them from other economists. And I'd have to go through each of the weird doctrines and say, well, here's the problem with this doctrine. But so, we already mentioned one of the main ones. So there's this Austrian idea that unless you actually act upon a preference, demonstrating behavior, it does not exist.
Yep, that's one.
Right. So so that is one weird one. Let's see. Another strange one. Austrians have a problem with probability theory, whereas other economists say, all right, well, there's a probability this happens. There's some philosophical issue that a lot of Austrians have, say, no, you can't say there's a 10% probability that Vivek wins the Republican primary. And it's like, seems like I can. I just did. I said it. I understand what it
means. I wrote it down. Look at this. Yeah. Okay, well, that is very weird. I think I would love to expand this conversation as to what in Austrian economic philosophy requires these weird assumptions, but we cannot ask that question. I have to ask, maybe we'll talk about it next time if we have you on again, which I would love. But the last thing I want to ask you about is immigration, because I saw a book where you were making a case against immigration.
No. No. My book is Open Borders: The Science and Ethics of Immigration. It's pro, it's a pro Open Borders book.
I must have misread. Okay, so pro immigration. On the national level. And so why is that? Is it just lower priced labor is just good for everybody?
Like the intellectually strongest economic case for immigration, again, comes down to something you can see with your own eyes. We take someone who's shining shoes in Haiti, making $1 a day. We put him on a boat, bring him to Miami, and guess what? Suddenly he's making $100 a day.
Yeah.
All right. It's like, how did that happen? All right. Now, of course, it also works. Like if you go and bring a Mexican farmer into the U.S., take him from his farm in Mexico, put him on a U.S. farm. Suddenly, he's making vastly more money. And how can this happen? The answer is that the same labor is just vastly more productive in rich countries and in poor countries for so many reasons.
Yeah.
Like because the labor is more productive, they make more money, which isn't just good for the immigrant. It is good for humanity. It is good for humanity to move labor from where its productivity is low to where it is high. So in the case of something like agriculture, sorry.
So this is the pushback here, which is I'm not going to disagree with you that it's good for the individual and it's good for humanity on a global level. I think the concerns that have often been raised, interestingly, by people like Bernie Sanders as well as people like Trump, they agree on this, and I'm somewhat sympathetic, but again, divided mind because I'm a market guy as well. Is that okay, cool, but my priority isn't if it's good for the immigrant, and my priority isn't if it's good for humanity on a global level. My concern is if it's good for my nation specifically and the people living here. And the people living here who are born here getting priced out of the market by a whole bunch of low-cost labor influx is bad on the national level. Do you think that that's true and just not important enough? Or do you think that that's not actually the case?
Right. So, actually, the main effect on output is in the country where you go, because 80% of the modern economy is services, almost all of which have to be sold to people in the country where you live. So, restaurant meals and taking care of kids and, deliveries and gardening. But again, this is really actually almost exactly like your issue with replacing truckers with robots or with driverless cars.
Yeah, no, it's a very similar.
It's the same idea. And here's the simple slogan. The secret of mass consumption is mass production. Countries are rich and people have high living standards when production per person is high. And I'd say that the number one principle of economic policy is once you know that, stop and do it. No further discussion. That's it. Otherwise, you're just going to be listening to a million complainers coming up with a bunch of different reasons to hold back progress, which is bad on average for people, for natives in your country as well, to hold back that kind of progress. If you say, well, look, are there some losers? Yes, of course, there's some losers, right? Like when we let in all kinds of foreign econ professors, this is bad for me. You can take out your violin and play it for me, poor Brian. But it is the same idea. Now, in terms of, what about the effect on workers' wages? Remember, there's two things going on with wages. There's the competition of the people that do the job that you do. But then there's also the competition for your dollars of the people where you purchase the products they make, right? And you always have to remember both sides of this. When you're thinking about yourself, you have to say, all right, well, there's some immigrants here. There's more competition, but there's also more production. And then it's like, well, what actually gives me a higher living standard on net? And the answer on average is definitely going to be whatever gives higher production on net.
And
for individuals, it does vary, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe truckers will be worse off because of driverless cars. I don't know. Although even there, if you do want government to do something about it, the sensible thing is never to hold back progress. The sensible thing is to go and write a check to the people that have lost out, taking advantage of the fact that because we're richer in total, that check pays for itself and more.
Yeah. So the idea is that with higher production, if you have higher production, then it kind of lowers prices, and then the lowering of wage doesn't.
Yeah, it doesn't kind of lower prices. It totally does. Often it just means that products exist that were simply not available before. Right. So, like you're too young to remember travel agents. The internet, this is a whole occupation that the internet essentially destroyed. Right. So back in the old days, you know how you got a plane ticket?
Called somebody.
Well, that was pretty sophisticated. Usually you would drive to the travel agent. Because over the phone, it was hard even to go and explain your options. You have to sit down with a person. Where do you want to go? And then it's like, well, there's 3 different possible flights that you could take to that place. Oh my goodness, what are my choices? And they go over it. Yeah, so sometimes you call, but actually, usually I remember going in person to the travel agent and just to get like the simplest ticket for the simplest thing. And it's like, what? All right, and then, will you need eating hotel there? Yes. What about hotels? All right, well, I could. You have a choice of 3 hotels that you might go to. This is an industry destroyed by the internet. That it's one where just the product as we think of it now really just didn't exist in those days, or at least it was such a shadow of what we now take for granted. And it's because of this that your money actually is so much more worthwhile. You can get so much more out of it. And just think about like any time that a business opens that you like to consume it, that really is pretty much the same thing as you got a raise.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that I would love to talk to you more, especially about the difference between Austrian economics and market economics. I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about immigration, but
usually called neoclassical economics, by the way, or although I also say behavioral economics. Sure.
Neoclassical or behavioral. Very nice. But unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you so much for being here. Your book is Unbeatable, right?
Oh, so that one is still only half written.
Right.
So I've got another book coming out before that, which will be Build Baby Build: The Science and Ethics of Housing Regulation, coming out in April 2024. But all of my books are available right now on Amazon. So I got 8 books available, 8 books that are currently out there and available for sale. And then also you can go to my Substack, which is just Bet on It.
I like that. I see now. I understand the joke with that title. That's fun.
Yes.
Government does bad things that sounds good, and then markets do good things that sounds bad. I'm keeping that quote forever.
All right. Yep. Okay. That's the slogan of Unbeatable.
All right. Yeah. It's gonna be the thumbnail. Thank you so much. Appreciate having you on. Good to see you.
All right.